Gleb Nerzhin, the autobiographical hero in Solzhenitsyn's The First Circle, says at one point on a conversation with Lev Rubin, while recalling their experiences on the Great Patriotic War, that the only good war is one that is over and done with. And Spanish Renaissance humanist Juan Luis Vives justifies that quite clearly when he points out in his work Introduction to Wisdom that no man can wage war against other men or hurt them without committing a crime. Hence, to take war in a light manner or with a positive mindset freed from any weight in the conscience reveals at best naivety or at worst insensibility, both attributes being at odds with the understanding required to judge the gravity of the subject. This means that war films whose depiction of human suffering is frivolous, one-sided, or are exclusively subordinate to technical or aesthetical aspects are likely to come across as unfulfilling, shallow, or insipid, turning them into imperfect or tasteless representations of the matter at hand, no matter how grandiose and bombastic they may appear on a surface level. Filmmaking, as an art, has the conditions and the right to present reality in ways that allow the spectator to obtain an overview that is comprehensive and faithful to the original matter, so as to evoke also empathy towards innocent, ordinary human beings subjected to this ghastly and primitive business that is still practiced today, sometimes even not merely to protect values such as liberty and welfare, but in order to allow a small group of heads to profit immensely at the expense of an entire people. This is then the premise and the reason to present a group of 10 war films in chronological order that are likely to be absent from most rankings of the genre, and which are probably not as well known to the casual viewer as the widely known Hollywood classics and blockbusters. Some of these are often, and not entirely unfairly, labeled as anti-war films, for the opposite term is usually meant for less conscious ventures that regard patriotism and the overly simplistic good versus bad dualism as the main guidelines, striving primarily to entertain the audience instead of enticing it to ponder on the subject. Not all the selected films necessarily have ambitious battle scenes, but all of them happen during wartime and deal with the violence, cruelty, and injustice stemming from its circumstances. Despite the technical limitations from certain periods and different contexts of production budget-wise, they display, however, a more extensive view of warfare and its consequences on a broader or more intimate level, being sometimes more poignant than any other more famous and recent examples, by displaying facets often neglected and subtle nuances disregarded by other commercially oriented productions. Despite having been made exactly 90 years ago, Westfront 1918 impresses with its raw power and punishing depiction of trench warfare in World War I as seen from the eyes of German soldiers. The atmosphere in the film is sober yet disquieting, and not only do the battle scenes feel gritty and realistic to the point of inducing shell shock, but its overall bleak tone, present even while away from the front lines, effectively captures the sense of disenchantment and absurdity that developed on those who've witnessed the nightmarish action of World War I, in sharp contrast with the preceding romanticized conceptions of war and military chivalry that most people projected then, therefore offering a rendering of the conflict that pays tribute to the madness imposed on those who lived and died in the trenches in no man's land. This is perhaps one of the earliest renderings of the conflict that doesn't stray from the horror and convincingly portrays what it feels like to be sprawling knee-deep in mud with the constant threat of an artillery barrage or sniper fire in an alien landscape where death seems to be the only all-powerful ruler. Directed by the brilliant Austrian filmmaker G.W. Pabst, who would create remarkable films in German, English, French and Italian language, and with actors that were themselves a decade earlier wallowing in the festering trenches of World War I, Westfront 1918 acts as a harrowing counterpoint to another film from the same year produced in the USA, the more famous All Quiet on the Western Front. Here's a film whose high reputation among educated film viewers stands far from the almost complete neglect by the majority of the public. Being hailed ever since its premiere as a superior film and afterwards firmly established as one of the finest war films ever made, La Grande Illusion prestige and current assessment confirms it as part of the French film canon, but unfortunately this did not translate to widespread knowledge of it for the common viewer. The film deals with an escape attempt from a group of French officers being held as captives by German forces in a prisoner camp, which have enacted a sort of miniature replica of society within the compound, with a concrete protocol and mutual respect performed on both sides, which is nevertheless an impressive yet ultimately concocted illusion, for its existence can hardly be taken as objective and substantial, while everything else falls apart outside its boundaries. The film is directed by Jean Renoir, son of the famous Impressionist painter Pierre-Auguste Renoir, who is regarded as one of the finest, if not the finest director in French history, and responsible by what is also considered by many as one of the best and most influential films in history, The Rules of the Game. In this 1937 film with enduring characters and unforgettable dialogues, he excels in crafting a prime example of humanistic cinema, in which extreme circumstances may serve as an unexpected opportunity to further emphasize the dignity, friendship, compassion and tolerance that should work as the guiding principles of humankind at all times, beyond the superficial class, geographical and political differences, while simultaneously forming an indictment against the futility of war as a means for changing the world for the better, while exposing its heinous consequences. Rome Open City is one of the most representative films of the famed trend of Italian neorealism, but not only that, it's also one of the most affecting war films and undisputedly one of the greatest examples of filmmaking in general. The story deals with the lives of multiple characters rooted in the city of Rome during German occupation in World War II, their differing affiliations, ethics, goals, challenges, and the implications of their actions, the fallout from their display of honor, faith, bravery, betrayal, immorality, or selfishness. The complexity of people's emotional and physical entanglement is skillfully drawn by Roberto Rossellini, a director with perhaps similar reputation in Italy as the aforementioned Jean Renoir in France, resulting in a powerful illustration of civilian life in wartime, its constraints and sacrifices, the family responsibilities and patriotic commitments, the friction between the chilling price paid for the standing against evil and the pervasive temptation to capitulate in order to attain survival. Facing the paucity of monetary funds, Rossellini was required to go for a documentary-like style that showcases real locations and people, therefore conferring an aura of touching authenticity to its story, crystallizing it at the same time into a style that would become one of film's most iconic and influential trends. With its sheer frankness and simultaneous monumental message, Rossellini took by surprise the audiences all over the world, which led him to being awarded with a Palme d'Or at the recently inaugurated Cannes Film Festival in 1946. Rome Open City is an exceptional piece of filmmaking that should be required viewing in every film school, and for individuals wishing to understand how war affects all people outside the battlefields, independently of their position or role in society. War has rarely felt as close to a horror film as in Canal. In this 1956 masterpiece of Polish filmmaking by the master director Andrzej Wajda, also responsible for another great World War II classic, Ashes and Diamonds, the last days of the Warsaw Uprising during the war are dealt with almost unbearable darkness and relentless intensity, due very much to its suffocating and claustrophobic atmosphere, almost completely devoid of mercy and hope. A group of Polish soldiers and civilians retreats after becoming surrounded by German forces, forcing them into the sewers of Warsaw's center. Once in there, they face dispiriting ordeals that put to the test their physical resistance, their mental resilience and human integrity, while rare glimpses of humanity occasionally surface, although very briefly. In this evacuation, their challenges are often followed by tragic results that range from bodily injury, despair, enemy capture, insanity, hallucination, death, and suicide. The movie is a relentless portrayal of the soul-crushing experiences that befall ordinary humans during wartime, when all hope is gone and everything seems doomed to disintegration, while refusing to give up and struggling to maintain one's sanity among senseless brutality. On a curious note, the film shared the jury prize at Cannes with none other than the famous The Seventh Seal by famed Swedish director Ingmar Bergman in 1957, a festival edition that also saw Robert Bresson awarded with the Best Director prize for A Man Escaped, and Grigory Shukhrai, the 41st, receiving also a special jury prize, both also fine war films from great directors, which will be discussed too on a later video. What happens when indoctrinated, naive and innocent children, who should never be allowed to participate in warfare in the first place, but who've been consistently lied to and inadequately prepared by an unscrupulous military authority, willing to employ desperate measures, are faced with war in all its unflinching ferocity. The result is depicted in The Bridge, a 1959 German film with horrifying and unforgettable dexterity, exposing the lunacy and pointlessness of war with stirring effects. In it, 7 teenage German boys learn the hardest lesson of their lives, after a series of circumstances go wrong and an apparently harmless defensive placement on a strategically unimportant bridge becomes the focus of an actual military engagement against very real American soldiers, naturally unaware of the nature of whom they're fighting. The Bridge could perhaps be naively described as a wartime coming-of-age tale, if it weren't so ruthless and disheartening, as the enthusiastic yet completely oblivious teenage boys have their expectations completely shattered and their lives forever changed when confronted with the savagery that is bound to follow closely any and all wars. The film was awarded with several national and international prizes and garnered Bernard Vicky international recognition and earned him a co-directing role in The Longest Day, an American war film about the D-Day invasion, and for a long time considered the most faithful depiction of the Normandy landing until Saving Private Ryan came out. The Bridge is not for the faint of heart for sure, but is indispensable viewing and a powerful antidote for spectators unwilling to acknowledge the dreary dark side of armed conflict, and still relevant today, an age where the conscription and brainwashing of children is still practiced by despicable warlords and terrorists. Miklós Jancsó, legendary Hungarian director, visionary filmmaker, and disputable cinema master, presents his outlook on the subject of war with a touch of cinematic midas in The Red and the White, through the eyes of Hungarian soldiers held captive at the end of World War I and the beginning of the Russian Civil War, depicting their role in the conflict between Red forces and the White Army. The motivations vary among them, as some hope to use it as a means to get back home, while others have ideological affinity or are forcefully conscripted to it. In the end, what remains is the sheer senselessness of the violence practiced by both sides, the precarious survival during wartime often depending purely on a whim or entirely on luck, while exhibiting the nature and full spectrum of evil that arises with the lawlessness of war. The sense one obtains while watching the film is of how random and merciless a conflict can be, indeed how fleeting one's life really is when stepping onto the stage of such hideous play, and by extension, how we should all strive to work out that this is kept from repeating at any point in the future. Adding to the chilly subject and superb performances, The Red and the White is also the classic Jancsó photography masterclass, more precisely with the mobile and elegant character of the camera bearing a sophisticated eye for composition, especially in landscape format. All wars are terrible, yet civil wars have a particular brutal and tragic character to them, and The Red and the White, though unknown to most people nowadays, is a superb example of that, which ought to be observed and studied by any educated film viewer interested in history and filmmaking alike. During the first half of the 20th century, Russia and what would become the Soviet Union were involved in an unusually high number of wars, campaigns and revolutions, and therefore it's only natural that its film industry took inspiration from it for many of their productions. However, despite the mandatory ideologically sound and Politburo-financed productions, many of these were not simply communist propaganda for the masses, but instead mindful and polished explorations of such extraordinary circumstances. Trial on the Road by Russian director Alexei German in his solo directorial debut, a filmmaker perhaps more well known in the West for his late brilliant and extravagant, literally life-consuming sci-fi journey How to Be a God, is one example of first-rate, circumspect filmmaking, telling the story of a captured Soviet sergeant previously forcefully turned Nazi collaborator, who falls into Soviet hands again while the Great Patriotic War still rages on. The film was censored and taken out of circulation in the Soviet Union for 15 years, due to the controversial, though others will call it nuanced or variegated, depiction of Soviet soldiers, but it's actually in here that lies its greatest strength as a film. Carried by a trio of outstanding Soviet actors, all of them having performed in Tarkovsky's movies at one point or another, namely Vladimir Zamansky, Anatoly Solzhenitsyn, and Roland Bykov, Trial on the Road is a remarkable tale of honor and redemption that presents the multiple shades, distinctive features and profound natures of men operating in a bloody and ruthless environment. The psychological complexity of each character is so expertly drawn it astounds and mesmerizes like few films, as there are no clear good or bad characters, just like in real life, but ordinary people with various motivations and beliefs, each bound to their own individual sense of justice, duty and honor, each with their own uniquely personal soul. Another example of superlative Soviet filmmaking has the name of The Ascent, the final masterpiece from female director Larisa Shepitko, who died in a tragic car accident just 2 years after directing it. In The Ascent, the spectator is treated with a somewhat allegorical Christ-like fable set during World War II, with both physical action and psychological depth, translated to tense combat scenes and complex moral dilemmas, rooted in poetical undertones, heartfelt emotion, and with robust philosophical substance in the dialogues. The plot involves mainly 2 soldiers of the Red Army on a reconnaissance mission ordered by the leader of a routed platoon carrying civilians too within its ranks that are facing provision scarcity and heavy fatigue during particularly heavy and cold winter snowing. The 2 soldiers come across different people, all desperate like them for diverse reasons, and though at the beginning they display different dispositions, ethics and background, they eventually bond, and surprisingly, their attitudes are reversed, especially when confronted with the threat of imminent torture and death by the German and collaborationist Russian forces. The Ascent is, much like Trial on the Road, a bold and realistic depiction of the variety of human reactions to wartime and its duress, showcasing instances of both courage and cowardice among Russian subjects, but also displaying without sugarcoating the suffering on both military forces and ordinary civilians, accomplished by the indifferent hands of evil and guiltless consciences, but which most importantly exalts the dignity of those who face their final hours at the hands of their wretched executioners with stoicism and fortitude, like so many Russians did during this dreadful conflict. The same Larisa Shepitko that directed The Ascent was married to another director named Elen Klimov, a multifaceted filmmaker that created movies of very distinct tone and style, but is nowadays mostly known for his final masterpiece, Come and See, though curiously and perhaps unknown to most people, the original title of the film, Idi Smotri, actually means Go and See. This film may be the most widely known in this list, though it still retains somewhat of a hidden Soviet gem status, not unlike the previous 2 films, and therefore requires exposure to a wider audience like only YouTube may provide. If Canal had an almost horror feel to it, Come and See, however, is truly a nightmare brought to life that almost reaches surreal heights by brandishing a barbarous, hellish but very palpable and realistic terror. Similar to The Bridge, Come and See tells the story of a naive boy during World War II, this time in Belarus, brimming with innocent expectations and juvenile fantasies concerning war, completely unaware of the consequences and suffering that it entails. Very soon, he unveils the true face of war, and his in-depth learning of it changes him forever, literally beyond recognition by the time it reaches the end of the film. Many episodes in Come and See are incredibly haunting, harrowing to the fullest extent of the word, the intensity of some being close to unbearable and therefore not easily forgotten. This is very much due to the viciously graphic nature and action of the scenes in many cases, but also because they seem so very real in the first place, a realism enhanced by the consistent employment of specific cinematic techniques, but also captured by the effect of live ammunition and powerful explosives that reverberate with deafening impact and aid the mesmerizing quality of the scenes. Come and See is a frightful, perhaps even scarring, cinematic experience that will leave no one indifferent, but beyond that, it's a gargantuan piece of peerless filmmaking that must be seen by as many people as possible, and the closest to an anti-war monument a film could ever be. Flanders, by Enfant Terrible Bruno Dumont, is the most recent war film on this list, yet it differs substantially in pretty much all areas from every film of the genre from recent times. In Flanders, the pace can be quite slow, but has its root on the contemplative side of nature that is often portrayed on screen, and while information is kept to a bare minimum, this affects in no way the raw power of its terrifying, uncomfortable scenes, whether they happen in the middle of the action or far away from the war zone, therefore avoiding the confinement to a specific era or conflict and making it more universal. The plot describes how the life of a simple young man and his romantic relationship with a girl living in the prosaic and uneventful but charming French village is affected by the appearance of another man and the conscription of both men to a conflict in an unnamed country from what appears to be the Maghreb or the Middle East. Once in there, their primal instincts, the sort of base, animal impulses that come up in a state of chaos and that betray mankind's primate origin, whether purely based on survival, sexual gratification, or with the aim of gratuitous violence, are given a platform to express themselves, though these carry their own terrible after effects. Such deep exploration of the human psyche under turbulent circumstances has seldom been exhibited on this brand of film, and with such vigor and crude effectiveness, despite the immense intrinsic potential of the theme to do so, arguably due to its undeniable psychological impact. Therefore, Flanders, which has been awarded the Grand Prix at Cannes in 2006, deserves to be watched as a war film that goes beyond the superficial tropes and aims of the genre, for it presents a darker side of conflict where glory, honor, justice and discipline are frighteningly missing, showcasing the true horrors of war and the barbarous, most terrible facets of the human soul. Here are then 10 war films which most people probably aren't acquainted with and which offer quality alternatives to other more well-known Hollywood productions. Some of these might be hard to find, but they are well worth the effort, so I'll leave the links for buying them on the description. As an extra, I'll mention another brilliant Soviet war film with out-of-this-world cinematography, great acting and powerful emotional punch called The Cranes Are Flying, of which a detailed overview is available on another video on this channel. The link will be on the description, so have a look at it if you'd like to learn about its preponderance and novelty features, so impressive that earned it many festival prizes and a much-deserved true classic status. Also, feel free to mention in the comment section other films of the genre you think are often overlooked and worthy to unearth and clean the thick layer from the dust of time. There's another video with 10 more neglected war films coming in the future, so consider subscribing if you wish to be notified when it gets uploaded, or simply to discover and learn about more classic film masterpieces. Thank you for listening and see you next time.